It's a thrill for us at Spiritual Directors International to have you be one of our keynoters at our conference in May of 2022 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we're really looking forward to your participation. And
Mhm.
so, with this brief interview, I wanted to introduce you to our community.
So, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here with you. Um, I think what interests me about this work and bringing contemplative practice to the center of what we mean when we say social justice is this idea that, I'm a third generation civil rights family member. What that means is that my grandfather did security for Dr. King, and my grandparents were very engaged in civil rights work during their time. They raised my mother to integrate schools. There was a lot of moving within systems that has come to me over the generations around what does it mean to deepen empowerment as a Black African American Jewish woman. And so as I learned to have my inner meet my outer, that means that what I'm going through in the world, not allowing that to steal my joy, not allowing that to leave me not centered in the gift that I am to the world, the gift that I am to myself and to my family, and to allow my inner also to impact the outer, meaning that who I am inside remains a gift, does not get off centered, confused, or distracted by what I'm encountering in the world, even when what I'm encountering actually is racism. That has been a walk that has always been a part of who I am. And to be able to have the inner match the outer as an intersectional woman, meaning with an identity as a woman, with an identity as a Jewish woman, with identity as an African American Jewish woman, holding all of that together and not letting parts of myself become separated in the world takes a deep level of practice and presence and commitment. And so, what brings me to this work is that I didn't want to see the idea of being in social justice as separate from that practice. I'm a deeply spiritual person. Um, my Judaism has deeply informed my ability to see that I'm in relationship with something bigger than myself. And so, as I learned from my teachers who have been Baha'i, who have been Jewish, who have been Muslim, who have been multi faith, as I learned from my teachers, what does it mean to see the work of social justice as part of my inner practice? It made me stronger, and it gave me a way to be able to stay in relationship with people's humanity in a very significant frame that has deepened and expanded my capacity to do the work. So I don't think my practice would be my practice in terms of both social justice and contemplative practice if they weren't braided somehow within me in terms of what it means to move through this world with our humanity and our dignity in place.
Yeah, and that word braiding, I think, is I'd love to talk to you about how you blended and integrated what most people would think are disparate identities into a coherent whole. But I want to take a slightly different approach into it, which is contemplation and action, right? I mean, these are very broad categories, and
Yes.
most people treat them as mutually exclusive, right? You were just talking about how you're a spiritually grounded social justice activist, and I'm
Yes.
paraphrasing, maybe putting words in your mouth. Correct me if I've done that incorrectly.
No,
But
that's
but it's what we're trying to get into as spiritual directors and spiritual companions is this engaging with the fact that contemplation and action are actually not disparate, that they're deeply connected. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you see contemplation and action, quote unquote, around both of those terms, blending together, integrating together in your own life, and what you might have to propose in terms of or model for spiritual directors and spiritual companions who are looking to do the same.
Yeah. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how it connects directly to the work that I do. So I'm an anti-racism teacher and an anti-racism spiritual practitioner. That's how I identify in the world. And what that means is that I work to create a deep sense of awareness of both my ancestry, of my energy, of who I am in this moment and what I bring to the world. And before there's anything else, before there's anyone else, before we're talking about systems and structures and institutions, that is the beginning of the work. At what level of awareness am I moving through the world? That awareness brings me into communion and deep connection with others. Because if I can be deeply aware of myself as a Black woman, as a Jewish woman, as a woman, then I can also see where I'm in relationship with others and where I have a deep connection and a sense of community with other human beings based on what I know of myself. Now, some of that in terms of contemplative practice brings us together to do things like sit, right? To be in stillness with one another. But in that practice of quieting our minds, in that practice of centering ourselves, in that practice of being in silence, in that practice of meditation, what should be happening is it should be strengthening our core root of being able to move through the world with our own humanity intact and our ability to receive others' humanity similarly. So that practice itself, I know of, not just in terms of learning it in sits with other people who practice contemplative practice through meditation. I know that because that is what my grandfather taught me they needed to do to be able to go down south and do voter registration. They had to be in that place of stillness. They had to be in that place of centeredness in terms of that this was about their humanity, that this was about love, because they were walking amongst human beings who did not have that sense of centeredness, who did not have that sense of love. And in order to welcome them into a new reality, into a new space, their strength came from their being centered inside. So I know that as a first person story. And because I know that as a first person story, I know before I go to do anything that that is my work. So it's almost a yin yang, it's a breathe in, breathe out, that if I'm going to be effective in the work, I also have to be centered and present and have the capacity for stillness inside. That has been of service to me. Other things that I can say about that in terms of how the two go together. There's ways in which, as we move through the world, just moving through the beautiful world that is around us, we are being witness to issues in the world around social justice that need our attention and our presence. So often, I've been, for instance, when Mike Brown was killed in St. Louis, we did essentially a contemplative practice march. And that meant that for every minute that Mike Brown's body lay in the street, we stood in silence with one another, just in a march, people walking in silence and stood in silence. And then a gong would sound, and we would walk another certain number of feet, and then we would stand in silence again. And so it was a slow progression of people moving in silence and in protest, but it was deeply grounded in contemplative practice so that our awareness was matching awareness around us of the people who were with us, was calling attention to what is happening in the world that has created rupture, right? And are we beaming outward into the world to create healing? Moments like that are so powerful because often we think the work of change in the world is about doing and not about being. And when you have a very, very powerful way of being that you bring to the work of change, it allows people to enter into that space and really transform, as opposed to talk, as opposed to what do we call virtue signal, as opposed to hold a nice sign. If you have to sit in silence with the reality of what is, with the reality of what's happening in our world, I don't think as a human being you can do that without emerging from those moments change. So there have been moments in my life where I've been doing that both and I tell people about some of those moments. That was one, but there are many others where we can learn what it means to take our practice and not just keep it inside the small enclaves and the communities that we build that feel safe and comfortable and relative to what we've always known. What does it mean to take our practice out into the street is something I'm deeply curious about and something that I engage in all the time. So I hope those are two good examples of where the practice actually lives with me in my social justice work.
I think those are wonderful examples, and I especially resonate with what you said about the focus being on being rather than doing, or actually being as a form of doing, modeling. And
Yes.
I completely agree. I mean, as a Zen priest, it's all this meditation is just the ground on which you build enough stability to walk through the world with some serenity,
Yes.
forbearance. And
Yes.
so for our spiritual directors and spiritual companions, many of whom are very introverted and very shy, contemplation is an end unto itself. Very often becomes an end unto itself. And so then they find themselves saying, well, I'm very contemplatively grounded, I'm prayerful, I'm connected with the divine, with God, with the beyond, however they might refer to it. But when it comes to walking through the strife of the world, I don't know what to do. And this is a softball question because I can anticipate your response to it. But what would you say is, if you're as contemplatively grounded and an introvert, how do you engage with the world meaningfully? Particularly when you were talking about, civil rights work, walking through a crowd of people who hate you, who hate everything you stand for, without losing your grace, without losing your cool, without losing your love, without losing your capacity to love deeply and insightfully. What would you recommend?
Yeah, this is our deep human work. I believe that our humanity is not fully complete until we can be in relationship with both light and shadow. I don't think the world is all light or all shadow. I think it's a combination of both. And that when we look out in the world, that's literally what gives shape to our reality. The balance between light and shadow. Where something is blocking light creates a form, and where something is actually creating space for light allows you to see a potential image. But it's that dance between light and shadow that is what holds life. And I think sometimes we get very comfortable with assuming that what happens with us that we can see that leaves us in a place of comfort has helped us to arrive at the deepest sense of our humanity. I'm not a believer in that. I believe that sometimes we have to push ourselves to be in presence with that which is hard, dark, shadow, and still insist on being present to that from a place of love, present to that from a place of courage, present to that from a place of deep, deep grace and humanity. And that when we do that, the I that comes out on the other side of that is changed and more human and deeper in practice and has more capacity around the contemplative practice. Now, many folks have not believed in the need to do that kind of testing, but if people will go back into their own practice, if they've ever had the opportunity to do a very long sit, it's often after that deep moment of facing the inner dark that the light comes on the other side. And if we create lives where we never have to face the dark that is around us, to some extent, we're not going to arrive at our own sense of nirvana, at our own sense of understanding for what the gift we have is to bring our humanity to the world. So yes to I'm shy. Yes to my practice is a quiet practice. It's a humble practice. And yes to your humble way of being when it meets the reality of what needs you in the world. may mean that you have to bring that humility face to face with someone else's other way of being and still hold on to it because you have strengthened your muscle, your internal muscle, for being able to endure both light and shadow. And if we only live in the light, I don't think we can fully be gift.
Beautifully said. Okay, last question is, and it's around this paradigm of fighting, right? We
Mhm.
see an injustice and we want to fight against. In many ways, we're conditioned to fight in the face of injustice, or in the face of, and sometimes you have to do that, right? If someone is beating up a child, you have to get in there as best you can to try to stop that. But beyond that paradigm of fighting, there's this idea of engagement, and you just touched on it, which is just walking through the world, modeling who you are, being as true to yourself after composting your darkness and your shadows and your traumas so that you can keep evolving, is showing up, is a form, is a response. And so I wonder if you have a few more thoughts on how to, and perhaps I'm inviting some thoughts on nonviolence, and which doesn't mean passivity, right? It was kind of like the Taoist concept of
Mhm.
yielding rather than trying to overwhelm your opponent. So I would love to hear what you think about that.
So, there's an article that came out, I think, at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement about an encounter I had when I first came to Boston. And um, I was running a big conference in Cambridge, and I had been sent to go get some granola bars for the bags for the young students, the young people who were coming to be with us for actually what happened to be, we called it Jubilee Weekend. So it was a weekend where students get to come together and engage with one another, build relationships. So I'd gone out to go get these granola bars, Rev and SeiFu, and I say they were looking for somebody who had hit someone else's car, and I drove through the town, headed toward the Costco, and police pulled me over at a gas station, and multiple different police cars surrounded my car. Now I hadn't gotten out of the car yet, but they had surrounded my car, and I didn't know why. And it was because my car and possibly myself, I was in sweatpants because wasn't dressed in my finest. I was in, regular normal clothes, matched some description of someone who they were looking for who was a drunk driver. So I tried to get out of my car. And as I tried to get out of my car, I was told at gunpoint to get back in my car and not get out. And until there was more backup that came. And that scared me really badly. And I started to cry. And I really was not necessarily in a place of presence. I was in deep fear in those moments. And at some point, I decided to call the police on the police and tell them, hey, you just don't know who I am, right? I want my dignity back. I want my humanity back. People have me captured here at a gas station. Help, essentially. And the person on the phone said, oh, don't worry. This isn't racism. I'm sure there's a reason why they have you there, but didn't help. And so I went to get out of the car and ask for them to at least give me some information. And I'm crying tears and still not getting any help. And eventually the second car came. They looked at my license, they talked to me and realized they had the wrong person. But right before this whole ordeal ends, I am gathering myself back together, recognizing they told me I can go. And there's a gentleman who is on the other side of the pump on the gas station who leans over and he says to me, hey, are you okay? And I'm like, no, I'm not okay. But he hands me his card and he says, listen, I just want to let you know that I was standing here watching this whole time. And if you need me to say anything about what happened to you, I'm happy to do that. Here's my card. And in that moment of witnessing, which is what he did, he restored dignity to me and that situation. Because where I felt targeted, right, in my body, in my dignity, by something I could not control, someone quietly, not saying a word, just standing there, bearing witness, possibly to their own detriment. He didn't know what would happen, right, if something happened with the police. He did something really, really important, which was to tell me that I'm not alone in the world and that someone else is watching over to be sure that justice prevails. Now, if we think about that in the process that we have for witnessing, right, for being with one another in ways that allow us to see issues of injustice as an opportunity to bear witness, as an opportunity to engage in deep contemplation, deep listening, to be possibly even a storyteller. All of those practices that we have can be in service to someone else. And that person was not loud, but that person made huge change in what could have been a really detrimental moment for me. So I tell folks that story because at every moment that there's injustice happening around us, we have opportunities like that to use our contemplative practice to help us to not be bystanders, but to be witnesses, to help us not to be, complicit with violence happening around us, but to help us to be interrupters just by the way in which we presence what is happening. And so fast forward, this happened many years ago, but fast forward to what happened around the park course just now with Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. How many people were there in witness? How many people were there in prayer? How many people were there sending the type of energy that needed to be sent into that space, as opposed to folks who were doing the work from a place of loud protest, from a place, and those things, it's a both and. I'm not saying we don't need both, but I'm saying there is a place for folks who want to bring that sense of deep presencing into power. If we do that in numbers and we just surround spaces that need our help and our hearts and our love, I believe that is a route toward change too.